Thanks. Does everybody have a chair who wants a chair? Because there's more chairs there if you on the steps aren't comfortable. Everybody's comfortable? Yeah, there's a couch space. Front row. Okay. So I'll introduce the panel. It's going to be me, Sue Barnhart, and Michael Kerrigan from Eugene, and Susan Cundiff from Eugene, and Susan. This is Susan, and then Michael and Cody, and Susan Jacobson from Eugene, and then Cody Urban, new to Code Pink, just his second week on the job. And so those of us down in Eugene were part of a local organization called Planet versus the Pentagon, and we're really happy today to be able to present to you a presentation that we've done once before. Still working on it, but and then to show you this wonderful banner that Susan has made. And after we each talk, then we'll open it up for discussion. People can ask any questions that you have. And I also want to put in a pitch for Nutric. It's a wonderful organization. I know many of you gave some money at the door, but we'll pass the hat at the end, and if any of you can give any more, because I'll tell you, Chrissy and Lincoln are just fantastic and do so much work for us, and we want to make sure that Nutric keeps being around for a really long time. Okay, so I'm going to start with Susan.
I bet you didn't know that every woman in Eugene is named Susan. I spent my entire career in public education for 32 years, the majority of that as a middle school counselor. And it was when I retired that I joined WAN, Women's Action for, used to be Nuclear Disarmament, is now Women's Action for New Directions. And the first program that I went to had a WAN field director talking about the federal budget. And I sat there looking at that pie diagram and realizing that all of those years in public education, when we were cutting programs and we were increasing class sizes, I understood it to be because there just wasn't enough money. And as I worked with students who were having difficulty in school and not wanting to attend, it was often because we weren't offering the things that drew them in. And I sat there looking at the federal budget and realizing we have the money. It's really about our priorities. And talking about the federal budget has become my favorite topic ever since. I realized in recognizing the enormity of that budget that a pie graph really doesn't hit you with the enormity of it. It always just kind of looks like a pie. So I have created a sequential bar graph of that budget, and that's what we're going to look at tonight. So we'll unwind it slowly. And Susan, if you want to come over here and hold this, and let's just start right here. Let's stop right here. Oh, we can go and show that this is federal budget. This is the discretionary budget. That's the portion of the budget that Congress has a say in. The president sends a proposal to Congress, and they look at it and slice and dice and talk about it, and the departments send their budgets to the president asking for this much money, and he ignores it or pays attention to it and creates his version and sends it to Congress. And so for this was the proposal for 2020, which I think they have not yet finished the defense authorization part of that bill yet for 2020. The scale is 3.25 billion per inch. I make every effort to be accurate as I sow this, and within a billion or two. I mean, if I'm off by half an inch, it's a couple billion. So this first, now the other budget besides discretionary is the mandatory budget, I should tell you, and that is interest on the debt. That's where a lot of that war interest ends up in that part, and that's mandatory spending. And Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, things like that are in the mandatory, but this is discretionary. And when you look at this portion of the defense budget, I want you to note that pay and benefits for the troops take up that much. So let's look at what else is in this budget, and we're going to have to go around. So now this is going to be hard for you to catch. Maybe we'll take this end around that way. There we go. That'll be more visible now. Okay. So now we're coming into the portion of the Pentagon part that is military contractors. Military contractors take up half. And we're now at the end of the Pentagon portion of this budget. So from here to there, military contractors, that's Boeing, Lockheed Martin, things like that, groups like that. And this portion is, some years ago, the Pentagon asked people within their organization to take a look at whether or not there was waste. There were ways they could save money administratively, because you've got Air Force, Army, Navy, a lot of them doing duplicate things. In fact, each of them has an air. So they looked at it and found $125 billion in waste. So like any responsible agency, they quickly tried to cover that up so that they wouldn't have to give it up. The reason the Pentagon had asked them to look for waste was because they wanted to then use that money in other ways. But they realized if Congress found out it was this big, they would probably cut that amount. Actually, that was ridiculous of them to think that, because Congress often boosts the amount of the Pentagon budget beyond even what the president has asked for. So we now come into the second largest section of this budget, which is for veterans. Let's stop it right there. Veterans, part of the budget used to be part of the Pentagon budget, but as our Iraq war veterans were coming back with such egregious injuries, and the Army hospitals were not treating them well, were not keeping up with it, weren't doing well. Citizens and Congress were outraged. And at that point, they separated out the veterans' costs in an effort to keep better track of it and to increase it. It's important to realize that although it's a separate section, it is obviously part of the cost of war. And so now we get to Health and Human Services. And let's keep going. And here is education. And let's stop right there. This represents K-12, higher education, state universities, public universities, and I'm blocking out on the before school, preschool, Head Start, Pell Grants. When I first started looking at the budget and talking about it, education was always second or third in size. Pentagon was always the biggest portion. Education was second or third. For the past 4 or 5 years, education has been bumped further and further down. Let's keep going. Homeland Security, which many of us recognize is also part of our militarized budget. And housing and urban development. So that's where did I say Pell Grants are in here too? Yeah. And housing and urban development, this would be community block grants and some issues like that.
But also impact fees.
I didn't hear.
But also impact fees.
Tax fees?
See, military bases don't pay any local taxes. And so the school board, the city, and so on get impact fees from housing and urban development. It does not come out of the, it does not come from the Pentagon.
I don't know much about that, I guess. Yeah, you're right, that the bases aren't paying taxes. Is that what you said?
Yeah, so the community gets compensation from the housing and urban development.
Yeah, good point.
Let's keep going. And finally, we're getting to the State Department, which is where diplomacy might occur if we had a functioning State Department at the moment, international affairs. And that's really, the State Department, as you know, has really been depleted under this Trump administration.
But
And
that also
here's
includes
where we might be
intelligence
dealing
agencies.
with climate change, climate crisis, energy and environment. It's part of the reason that we talk about the how underfunded this effort to deal with climate change is, and it's because we're spending so much money on the Pentagon budget, as well as the fact we'll talk about this a little bit later with our next Susan. The amount of contamination and greenhouse gases that are produced by the military. Okay, justice. So that's our court system. And transportation, which is where any mass transit and updating our infrastructure would take place here. Okay, agriculture, treasury, interior, commerce, and labor. These are at 1%, each of these 4 of the budget. In this budget request, Pentagon was 57%. All of the time that I've been talking about the budget, it's been over 50%. The Pentagon portion has been over 50%. So I know that many of you know a lot about this budget as war tax resistors. What Sue told me was she just didn't realize how bad it was. And if you're thinking this is overwhelming, I need to tell you that's not all. Because this is the slush fund. It's, you can take it out, hold it out right there. Several years ago, when Congress did sequestration, where they were trying to put budget caps on each of these categories, there was each of these categories on this end were being capped, and Congress said, wait a minute, if we're cutting by this much at this end, we have to cut by that percentage on the Pentagon budget as well. And then they did strike that deal, but then they said, oh, wait a minute, we're fighting wars currently. Maybe it was still in Iraq, Afghanistan, obviously, certainly. And if you're fighting war, you have to fund it. And so they said, well, this portion won't be subject to those caps. And it's called the Overseas Contingency Occupation, which has become known as a slush fund and has grown every year. And it's not being used for that in that emergency way for funding the wars when they're running out of money. They've actually been shoving a lot of the standard budget items into this so that they can keep increasing those futuristic contracts with contractors and keep that going. It was only within the last couple of years that I heard about Pentagon and climate, Pentagon and planet, and realized the intersection of those things. I've always seen it when there were cuts being made here, but this was the first time I saw a real effort to talk about them together and to come to the realization that we cannot deal with climate crisis unless we deal with the military, its spending and its emissions. And I'm going to wind this back up. And do you want to come up next?
I have a question. Does this include the military bases around the world? This fund?
It would be in there. Yeah. Yeah, no, all of the bases would be in part of that basic funding, yes.
So that Homeland Security is where I.
Susan?
Yeah.
Susan, kind of, it looks like there's a few questions. Should we take questions now
Oh.
or wait? I don't. Take them now, okay.
Yeah, and then we can.
Yeah, I'd just like to mention under environment and energy, that nuclear weapons are under the Department of Energy.
Yeah.
So when they're cutting from the environment, cleaning up the radioactive waste from the atomic weapons they're making.
Actually, nuclear weapons are not included in this amount. When it's graphed, they move it over into the Pentagon portion. But decisions about it are made in the Department of Energy, you're right. Yes.
I just have a quick question. Is that a slush fund, as you call it, is that in public information? Is that public knowledge, or do they keep it secret?
No, it hasn't been secret. A lot of Congress has talked about it, and it's quickly became known as a slush fund. The thing about it is, it doesn't have the oversight that this portion has. And we know how lousy the oversight is on that portion. This is even worse. That's a good question.
In California, we have something like that called the rainy day fund.
And of course, it's raining all the time. And the people that need the money never get it out of the rainy day fund because it has to be saved for a rainy day. But you can see it in the California state budget. Where can you see that? Like, is it on the war tax resistors pie chart? That particular fund is a source
I
of the
don't know
pie?
that for sure. I would guess not.
I think it's in there.
You think it is?
But I mean, it's not like a section of the pie
It's not a
chart,
section
but
of
it,
the pie
but
chart.
it's like noted in the description, like includes slush fund amount.
That's sneaky.
It's not part of that 57%.
Yeah. I mean, well, the war resistors league pie chart is about your income tax dollars, not the federal budget. So it's a little different calculation.
More questions? But I was thinking too that this is just the budget. It's not really what they spend. So what they spend is different from the budget. So it's even a higher amount that gets spent. Yeah, it's just the budget.
I think what is higher comes out of here.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I just know in education, oh, and I didn't mention, several years ago, Congress said, you know, I think it would be a good idea if every department passed an audit. And so they required it. And for several of the departments, they got that right away, passed an audit. Some of them took several years. The Pentagon has not been able to pass an audit. They hired a bunch of outside people auditors to try and figure that out. And they finally threw up their hands and said, we can't. You aren't tracking where the money's going. And when they're when people in each service or working with that budget are looking at it and can't make the numbers add up, they put in what's called a plug, which is making up the number that would help it balance. It has nothing to do with reality. So that's the absurdity as well. Yes.
Me?
Yes.
Two comments. That's a very effective display, very creative. Thank you. And the second is, I believe it's the June 2019 issue of Harper's Magazine. It's a cover story by Andrew Coburn. I believe it's called Military Industrial Vice. And it starts out by talking about government contracts. And there's, it's in the first paragraph or two, and they mention toilet tissue covers. And it's 10,000, something like 400 something. I couldn't wrap my mind around the toilet tissue for 10,000. You know, I remembered about 20, 30 years ago, some military budget, they were talking about toilet seats and all the qualification necessary was like, I don't know, 20, 30 pages for the qualification for a toilet seat. And I thought, no, they're talking toilet tissue covers, over $10,000 each. And when the congressman who represented that district was asked about it, he said, well, yeah, but, you know, they might go out of business if they don't. $10,000 for a toilet tissue.
That metal thing that sits over the toilet paper.
The toilet tissue, the little thing you pull off down.
Toilet paper.
Toilet paper cover.
No, the toilet the paper cover.
There is so much back and forth with the contractors, and you, I'm sure, remember that Eisenhower was the one who coined the phrase military-industrial complex. In fact, he first wrote in military-industrial congressional complex because he recognized that Congress was going to be part of that, partly because the contractors are then coming into and they're contributing to campaign finance. And the effort then of the military and contractors a different portion of that plane being manufactured in almost every one of the congressional districts. So that as soon as you talk about cutting the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, which isn't effective, it's dangerous, the generals don't want it, and Congress keeps granting more money for more of those. It's because if you stop that contract, then that will affect various employment of a few people in each congressional district. It's a complex and difficult issue to deal with. And we're getting
So we have a little change of agenda here because we knew that your speaker was supposed to speak about Washington. So Sue is going to take my role and I'm going to talk about Washington because I lived there for 12 years. I'm an artist, I'm an activist, and I was a teacher for many years. And I lived in Portland during the whole Iraq protests, and my kids grew up on the streets with me. And then we moved to Washington, and we lived in Olympia, which is, right next door to the Joint Bases. And it's also 10 miles as the crow flies to the naval base, and then it's, another 5 miles as the crow flies to Bangor. So I'd never really been around a lot of military until that point, and it is a very big,
Hold it really close.
a very big part of life. Olympia it's an interesting town because it's made up of state workers, longshoremen, farmers, evergreen students, and the base, military people. And so nighttime in Olympia is bar fight time. So a lot of people just don't go downtown in Olympia because it's just that mix of people just means fights and violence. The schools that my kids went to were closer to the base, so we had a lot of kids from the base at the school. And those kids, they're there for a year and then they're gone, so they don't develop relationships, and often they are in the challenged programs. And then the other thing that happens with the base, these are just kind of daily things to deal with, is Friday nights, I-5 shuts down at the base. And my husband worked over in DuPont, so it was always a struggle of getting out in time before the base let out and there was a car accident. There was always a car accident. So that's kind of, life every day. So where we lived down on Johnson Point. And my experience with that was this constant gun range noise. And we lived 10 miles away, but you heard it all the time. And then they do a lot of transport plane training there. And so you have these big, I call them pigs because they were so big. They'd be flying over every day. They flew over every day. But periodically, I think when they were doing special training, they'd fly really low. And they were really big and they're really loud. So all the windows in the house would just start rattling. The dog would freak out. And, that was kind of standard at our house 10 miles away. And then I remember this afternoon, I'd kind of forgotten this, probably on purpose, but they'd have these bombing practices. So they'd just be dropping bombs on the base. And it was like having an earthquake. The house would shake. It was so loud and so incredible. And there were times where they'd be going on for 2 days straight. And then they'd started fires over on the base because of these bombs, and a number of them got out of control. So that's what our life was like. The one kind of cool thing that did happen to me was I was walking my dogs on the beach one day, and it was right before an air show in Seattle. And the Blue,
Angels.
thank you, Blue Angels flew down our part of the sound, and they gave me a wing. And I was like, I ran up to the house, I was just like, Wes, you won't believe what happened. I was so jealous. So I was the only kind of excited. It was pretty exciting. But so in the process of doing this, I had to kind of go back and remember all the things that, I dealt with in Washington. And of course, you guys probably all are aware of Bangor and what goes on at Bangor. Well, for me, we were kayakers, and Bangor, to me means sonar, which means, harming wildlife. And it was a constant issue there. They just don't care.
Right.
They don't care about the wildlife and the sound, and it is one of the most beautiful places I've ever lived. The birds are phenomenal, the whales, the seals, we've had dolphins swim next to us in our boats, and those sonar are killing them. And they want to do more and more. They constantly are wanting to up it. And so it's this constant battle with Bangor. Well, so now what we're starting to have, and I knew this, but I didn't really know the extent of it. We just won a lawsuit with the Army Corps of Engineers. So I was up at the court, down up there for the hearing, and the person who I'd worked with up there was telling me about this stuff that was going on at Whidbey Island, which is, where the other base is, and they fly out of there. And people on Whidbey Island, kind of lived with this forever. They've flown jets out of there forever. And I think they got used to it. There weren't a lot of jets coming out of there. So it's kind of, you live with it. Well, now they have these things called growlers, which are a step above what they originally had. And these things are so loud that people's dishes fall off shelves on Lopez Island. You can hear them on Orcas Island. And they just want to continue as the shift to China, thanks to Obama, this shift to Asia, I should say. Now all these bases are moving west, and they're bringing more planes out. And so they want to just bring a ton more planes out. And they'll go from 6,000 flights a year to 24,000 in a year. And what they're finding is, so the Olympic National Park's out there, right? So these planes, they go up and out the one you've got, and then they come back over the national park. And the Hoh River was designated the quietest place in the lower 48. And if you think it's bad anymore, you're wrong. These planes are disrupting all of that. And guides up in Olympic, on the north end of the Olympic National Park, are saying that these planes are going over every 15 minutes. And it just is a ground shaking. And so, and that doesn't even get into, the oil they're using, right? So I don't know if you all know that Washington State and California are on the top 5 of not using carbon of all the states. Do you know why that is?
Can you say that again?
Military not included.
Washington State and California have made the top 5 states in lowering their carbon.
Oh.
So do you know why?
Good.
Because they got rid of the military?
Stop counting the military.
Because they don't
Oh,
count the
bingo.
military.
Wow.
So, my feeling is when I moved down here, really knew I was from Washington, I was in the middle of this, we sued the Army Corps of Engineers over a corporate shellfish operator who was using insecticides. So people knew I was from Washington. So when Inslee started running for office, of course, everybody would come home, we're excited, he's the environmental president. And I was like, no, he's not. And you know, he's not. He is a military industrial complex government. And he would, if he had been elected as the environmental president, he never would have touched the military. He never would have touched Boeing. He never would have touched Amazon.
Yeah.
All the military industrial complex is in Seattle. You know, there's, I think, 9 bases in Washington. There are 8 Superfund sites that are connected to those bases or to old bases, but they're connected to the military. There are a bunch more. There's a lot of Superfund sites in Washington. You know, and for such a beautiful state, it's really sad. And it is one of the reasons I left, because I just felt like my representatives could care less about me. They could care less about the environment there. They all talk the talk, and then they get into office, and Patty Murray and Maria Cantwell are always the ones that vote for the pharmaceutical industry. They vote for Boeing. They support Boeing every step of the way, even though Boeing screws them every step of the way. And so you can tell I'm kind of not really happy with my old state but on looking at all this stuff, what I found out is that it's not just Washington that's facing this big push forward. Idaho's facing it, California's facing it. They're starting to bump up all the activity at all these bases on the West Coast. And in Idaho, they are flying flights over a bird of prey sanctuary. And it's beautiful. I've been out there, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And you know, they're coming in, you know, at supersonic speeds and boom, and the noise that they're making, but they're not just doing that, they're going on over to the Wahi area and flying in there. So they're already coming into Oregon. And my fear after reading all this is that they'll actually try to open a base in Oregon. So I think we all have to be really, really watching what's going on in this state and making sure they don't come in here.
What are the jets that we often hear in Portland flying over, sometimes every day?
I think those are National Guard. Thank you.
All right, can y'all hear me? Especially in the back? All right, great. Cool. So thank y'all. As Sue said, my name is Cody. I'm a brand new organizer with Code Pink, leading the Divest from the War Machine campaign. I just want to recognize I'm very new, just a couple years into this life mission we call anti-war organizing. And I feel like I'm standing on some huge shoulders here, not just on the panel, but in the room here. So I really want to thank all of you for providing the big shoulders for my generation to really step on as we really fight this fight to end this war machine for good, because it's beyond time that we do that. I was asked to speak on the connection, a bit more on the, I mean, everyone has spoken on it, but a bit more on the connections between militarism and climate change. And I feel I'd be remiss if I didn't start this out by giving a huge shout out to the International School Strike for Climate movement that we've been seeing happening. I was on the streets here in Portland on September 20th with the thousands upon thousands of youth and students that were taking to the streets demanding a future. Like, to think that young people have to take to the streets to demand a future to live in. You know, and I think that when I think about anti-militarism work like this, I think it's the same demand, which is a future, because we know that a world that, especially a world that is dominated so much by our own governments, with the tax allocation we just saw, that over half of it is given to trying to ensure domination over that future for us. I really do see it. It is the same thing we're fighting for, is a future. So again, a big shout out to the School Strike for Climate. And I think I want to see a school strike for peace. I want to see a school strike against war. A school strike against war with Iran, against war with Venezuela, with Syria, against all occupations and all invasions, because it's really the only way that our so-called leaders are going to pay attention. So I think that what I usually go to, or my mind goes to when I think of climate change, who knows what the #1 polluter is?
The US military.
The U.S. military. The U.S. military has some of the highest carbon emissions, which is further driving the greenhouse effect, as we know. And even beyond that is the sheer amount of toxic dumps that are happening, mostly in the Asia-Pacific region, but truly anywhere where there are military vessels, which is everywhere on the ocean. But the level of toxic dumping, whether it's by accident or on purpose, as nuclear waste is quote unquote stored at the bottom of the ocean, is creating ocean biological collapse that is escalating every single day without most of our knowledge. The bombing runs that Susan was talking about, I remember seeing, the first time I saw a video what these bombing runs look like, of planes that just fly over and just carpet bomb whole islands, whole fields, forests, just to practice, you know? Not let alone the fact when they're actually doing this on whole communities of people, and thinking of all of the biodiversity that is destroyed through this. Like, I mean, Susan already talked much about that, but it is one of the #1 causes of biodiversity loss that we're seeing, yes, and full destruction of ecosystems. One thing that really struck me, I was at the 2 summers ago, I was at the Protecting Mother Earth conference near Olympia. It was hosted by the Indigenous Environmental Network, and there was a delegation that came, Diné Navajo delegation that came to speak specifically about the uranium, plutonium mining that is going on in Arizona. And I learned this new narrative about nuclear weapons, that from their birth to their use to even their waste, every step of the way is not just an attack on the land, but it's an attack on indigenous communities. Because the mines where the uranium is taken are happening primarily in indigenous communities that are affected through cancer rates and all other health hazards that come from the mining. The testing, again, quote unquote testing of nuclear weapons that happens mostly in the Asia Pacific region. I don't remember the name of the island, but the Marshall Islands. Yeah, there was one island in particular in the Marshall Islands that was one of the first test sites. Yeah. And see that the names just keep coming. And of course, a lot of these islands don't exist anymore because they just get completely obliterated. And then many, actually it was right here, exactly right here in the Peace House back in February. There was a delegation of indigenous women from Hawaii, Guam, and Japan. And one woman talked about how her community, her family, was displaced. We're told, oh, leave because there's going to be testing. And then years later was told it's safe to come back. And the half-life of the radiation that exists in all these areas means that it's almost never safe for these families to go back. And because of that, her family is now suffering cancer rates, as well as her entire nation. And then even after nuclear weapons are built, blown up, the waste is then still used against people. You know, we keep talking about we need to prevent nuclear war. We can't see the outbreak of a nuclear war. But of course, we've seen nuclear war already. I think this was Just when I was young, but I know many people in this room probably were big resistors of the Gulf War that happened, where depleted uranium, the actual waste that was taken from these nuclear weapons, was put into bullets and shot once again into indigenous peoples in Iraq by an invading army. So from mining to creation to detonation to even the garbage that is created, this is an attack on the land and indigenous communities around the world when we think of nuclear weapons. When we think of climate change, what do we think of? Shout out. What are some effects of climate change that come to mind?
Sea level rise.
Sea level rise?
Species extinction.
Species extinction.
Wildfire.
Wildfires.
Mass famine.
Mass famine.
Floods.
Floods. Yeah, whole ecosystem collapse.
Extreme weather.
Extreme weather. These are all elements that, again, we hear many people, even people who are on the right side of science in the US, and saying we need to stop climate change before it really starts affecting us. It is affecting us through all of these, but it's mostly affecting poor communities and communities in the global South, which are also at the forefront of US-led militarism. So I heard someone talk about mass famines and the starvation that comes from that. Well, it's usually famine, flood, drought. These are elements that are causing the refugee crisis that we see. And of course, the countries where refugees are fleeing from because of these environmental disasters are met with the harshest military crackdowns, either by their own governments that are funded by that budget that you just saw, our own tax money, or when they get to the US border, by our own military machine directly. So we actually see a militarization of climate refugees. And when this leads to quote unquote uprisings, which really just means people standing up for their rights and for their right to live and eat, we then see more militarized attacks that come on them. And it's usually the environmental and land defenders who are targeted the most, like in Brazil, like in the Philippines, like in Mexico. And then the last thing that really comes to mind for me is the aid. Like, we think of climate aid. Something that I learned not too long ago is that most of the times when there is climate aid that is sent in, well, that comes hand packaged and delivered through the military. So we all saw what happened, most of us remember what happened in New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina. And we saw complete communities devastated by floods that were then under practically martial law just because they were trying to fight for their rights. These were all working class communities, communities of color, that the military was sent in before FEMA to subdue the people before the quote unquote cleanup could be done. And then there's even other countries like in the Philippines where Typhoon Haiyan hit. Again, Typhoon Haiyan, at the time, the largest storm to make landfall that was driven by climate change, delivered by US soldiers that again had to subdue and pacify whole starving communities before any quote unquote aid was delivered. So even when we do see climate mitigation happening, when it's happened by a government whose tax system is like the one we just saw, we know it's always going to be packaged with the military. But that's okay because Boeing has fuel-efficient planes. They actually have a commercial for their fuel-efficient jets if you look on their website. But of course, Boeing, part of a war machine that is using oil to start wars to win more oil. So it's for all these reasons that I'm really happy that especially this year's conference is the focus on environmental, on climate justice when it comes to anti-militarism, because the one does not exist without the other. I think that we really do need to see the whole planet united against the Pentagon. So thank you, Eugene, for bringing that one home for us. And again, I think that the school strike for climate that we saw is a game changer. It's a game changer that it's actually demanding a narrative change it's a game changer in that it's actually shaking the halls of power. And it's a game changer in that it's truly an international movement that is uniting so many people along this sharp narrative change that we need to fight for our future. And I know that when we fight together, we win together. So whether we're fighting for climate or for peace, let's keep fighting together and we will see that future that we deserve. Thank you.
Woo!
Thank you all for sitting through this. It's been a pretty depressing talk. So I just wanted to mention a few things. My colleagues have covered a lot of great points tonight. But I don't know how many of you know that many veterans get deported. That's another thing our military is doing. So the military promises these young men and women that if they serve for 3 years, they can become U.S. citizens. And this has been going on since at least the Vietnam War. And then they never help them to become U.S. citizens. These people think they have become U.S. citizens, and usually they came to the country when they were young, maybe when they were babies or toddlers, and their siblings are all U.S. citizens. They often are married to U.S. citizens, have children who are U.S. citizens, and then at some point in their life, if they get into any trouble with the law, maybe some kind of traffic ticket or maybe a DUI or often something to do with maybe smoking pot or whatever, they get deported. And they can't come back to this country until they die. But when they're dead, they're able to be buried in this country. So this is another thing that our military is doing and our country's doing. And then as Cody was talking about, the climate refugees, they're coming in, they ask for asylum, and they aren't breaking the law when they ask for asylum. It's something that people all over the world are allowed to do, to ask for asylum if they feel they need it. Go to another country, ask for asylum. But in our country, put them into jail right away. And those jails are usually kept at 50 degrees or below. People aren't fed well. The holding tank that they first go into is a room this crowded, where not everybody can even lie down at the same time, where they're kept in it for 3 to 10 days. And the whole idea is that then when they're let out and interviewed, the first thing they're asked is, would you like to go back to your country? We'll fly you back to your country. And some people do. They're like, they had thought that they were coming to our country where they would be treated well. When they find out how they're treated, some of them do want to just go back and take their chances at being killed. That's another thing that, and it's part of the military budget, as far as I know. ICE and the Border Patrol and the wall. So I just wanted to mention that. So what can we do about it all? Oh, and then I also wanted to mention Michael's gonna, okay, he's covering that. And I did want to mention that look for it, because across the country there are going to be more school strikes. The youth are leading a strike right after Thanksgiving, Black Friday.
The international next strike is supposed to be Black Friday, but Sunrise is calling for the following week,
right,
December 7th.
Right.
And also, just so people know, it's not just a school strike anymore. The students led it, but they're asking everyone to strike from work,
right,
adults as well. So
thank you.
then it will become really effective if people do that. So
Right.
please spread that message.
Right, thank you. Yeah. I guess, Michael's going to talk more about what things we can do. And I know many of people in this room have been war tax resistors for a long time.
Yeah.
I became a war tax resistor because I didn't like the idea of killing people. And of course, I still don't like the idea of killing people. But really, it's only been the past few years that I've realized how the military is killing people, not just outright, but by being such a big polluter. Yeah, we've known about the threat of nuclear war for a long time. I've been working on trying to do something about that. And that threat's just as present today as it always was, and the pollution from all the nukes. But yeah, it's not just the outright killing of people, it's the slow killing of people. And now I'll turn over to Michael.
Oh, well, okay. So thank you, fellow panelists. We have to take action. Just 5% of the Pentagon budget could really fund great work to deal with climate change. For example, we need to redirect excessive military spending to fund the Green New Deal that progressives in Congress are pushing that. More solar, more wind power to lower our carbon footprint, and also to ensure that we have a future on this planet. I like this one. More money be transferred to create better public transportation, such as light rail. Building expensive tanks to get about 2 miles to the gallon. I'd rather subsidize electric cars. So I think continually getting out the message of what the Pentagon is spending money on is not doing us any good at all. I'm a big believer you need a broad activist toolbox. Just last week, the past 2 weeks, we met with Senator Merkley's Washington Chief of Staff came to town. And we had a meeting with Merkley staff to talk about what they could do to help us deal with climate change. And we have established a relationship. Most people on this panel, I mean, we're at that meeting as well. Good relationship with Senator Wyden's staff. We just got to keep on it and work with them. However, that is not enough. As you can see, I was involved in the climate strike in Eugene as well. And there were hundreds of students in the streets of Eugene. It was one of the most inspirational moments of my life. Those kids were phenomenal. And they are driving the movement in Eugene and Portland, I think all around this country. They are giving me a great hope. But also believe that, yeah, we do the lobby, we march in the streets, but direct action and civil disobedience need to be part of it as well. We did an action there's a bank called Chase, which is funding our fossil fuel projects in Southern Oregon. So we went and did a blockade of that bank. And none of us were arrested that day. They knew we were coming, but we got to be sending people the message. Take your money out of those banks, put it into the credit union. We got to think of all these variety of things to do if we're going to have a chance to succeed. Like I said, that week of the climate strike was just great. Meeting with Merkley's aide, they called us to meet. We didn't have to call them. So I think we're making great progress on this issue. And marching in the streets, that was so much fun marching down, with all those students. So I'm just saying that it's got to be intergenerational. I love seeing all you wonderful people in this room, but there's not too many folks under 30 here. But how do we get more war tax resistors from the younger generation? I'd love to have a discussion about that. So I think that's going to be. But just my final little piece here. Years ago, I worked for a statewide peace group called Oregon Peace Works, and we had a phrase there that if you want to have peace on earth, you got to be at peace with the earth. So I want to thank all of you for coming here tonight, and let's move forward and do all we can to save this planet Earth of ours.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask all of you here, for something that all of us need to do is when we take this banner out, people are shocked by it. So you guys need to go out and just talk to. I just talk to people now. It's like I don't care anymore what things to be, and I'm just like, this is what's happening in our country. All our tax dollars are going to the military-industrial complex,
And you need to know it, because that's why your schools aren't functioning. That's why our roads are crap. That's why we don't have a train system in this country. It's not because we don't pay enough taxes. It's because it's all going to the military industrial complex, and people don't get that connection yet. I just notice it, like we've taken this banner to a number of protests, and people are just shocked. And so what we can ask you guys is to really talk about that budget, because it's really important.
Well, the other thing is, if you look on the internet for federal budget, I mean, the government has a whole different pie chart. I mean, it doesn't look like that.
Separate the beds out, separate the NSA out.
Yes, Ann?
You probably know about National Priorities Project. They look at those trade-offs often, and that's an excellent source. And I've been reading from World Beyond War. The US military uses enough fuel in 1 year to run the entire mass transit system of the nation for 22 years.
Wow. Wow.
Ann?
Thanks for that latest